Davis himself at West Point believed that West Point was the way to go. And virtually all of the senior officers in the Confederacy were West Point graduates. Too bad. This was an extremely competent, able individual. He was referred to as the Marshal Ney. Marshal Ney was one of Napoleon's favorite marshals. Ney was nicknamed the bravest of the brave. And that's what Claiborne kind of liked for himself. But none of them, John Hood is made the commander. Problem is the Confederacy is running out of generals. The name Joseph E. Johnson keeps popping up because there's nobody else. Davis wants a full general to head whatever it is. There aren't many of them. Johnson is one, he is available, and although Davis didn't like him and he didn't like Davis, he would accept the command out of duty, out of a sense of duty. But this time he's not appointed, and by now, of course, Hood and his army are in Alabama. They're south of here. The Tennessee-Alabama border is somewhere around here. And shortly, just south of that, is a bend in the Tennessee River and the town of Tuscumbia, which is where Hood and his army regrouped. Tuscumbia, Alabama is in the news or has been in the news. It's the birthplace of Helen Keller. If you are in that part of the country and you want to see something inspiring, the Helen Keller Museum in Tuscumbia is absolutely worth seeing. It's obvious where Hood is going. As soon as he gets some kind of order, he's going to head north. And the only way he's going to go is, this is the Columbia Pike, now it's the Franklin Pike, now it's the Nashville Pike. It's still there. It's called US 65, Interstate 65. And it comes down this way and goes a little off this way. Going to go through Birmingham, which is a little bit to the south-southeast of the bottom of your map. Sherman meanwhile has started his march to the sea. He left General Slocum with a couple of divisions to guard Atlanta. Atlanta's safe. Hood's not going back to Atlanta. And he left Schofield to follow Thomas and protect Tennessee from Hood. And Hood is now heading due north. In his way to Nashville are two rivers. This is the Duck River at Columbia and the Harpeth River at Franklin. Neither of these two rivers is fordable. Now, they got to be bridged if there's going to be brought any kind of heavy stuff across, which the Union forces by now are very good at doing. Hood is moving north. He expects the Tennesseans to rally around him. After all, they are Southerners, and Tennessee did secede, and to basically help supply his army. This is fertile country. The farmers are not willing to supply his army. They will not accept his money. Confederate money is worthless. They would much rather be paid in U.S. greenbacks, which, although paper money had considerable value and, of course, would be redeemed after the Civil War. So Hood has trouble getting supplies from day one. And the Tennesseans are not going to rally around him. It's too late. They've been living under Union occupation for a long time. They were getting used to it. They were not a major slave-holding people in any way. Well, Hood's strategy is quite simple. Get to Nashville, get around Nashville, and go up here. Or if Thomas chooses to battle him, fight Thomas here in Nashville, destroy his army, goes without saying, and then continue his initial grandiose plan. He never stopped believing in that plan. That was his strategic goal ever since he left Georgia. But he's going slowly, and he is plagued increasingly by desertion. So that by the time he gets to Nashville, he'll have 23,000 men left. Thomas will have almost 60. So it's very uneven. He has to deal with this fellow, Schofield, who is left with 10,000 men to basically harass him. Schofield does not want to battle with Hood. Schofield's orders are to keep his army intact, to harass Hood, to slow him down, to delay him, and to get to Nashville ahead of him and join Thomas's forces for the great battle that they all knew was coming. Schofield is controversial. If you read enough accounts about the battles around Middle Tennessee in 1864, you read different stories about Schofield, whether he was utterly ambitious, whether he was incompetent, et cetera, et cetera. Here's an Army post named after him, Schofield Barracks in Honolulu, near Pearl Harbor. It's still there, as it was in 1941. So he couldn't have been all bad. Hood, meanwhile, is coming to the conclusion that his army is going soft, that they need battle to restore their fighting spirit, that they were not used to fighting anymore. Of course not. These are not professional soldiers. They never were. Most of them are farmers, either recruited, drafted. Confederacy had a draft the year before the Union did, or signed up for one reason or another. So he's going to look for a pitched battle. Hood is looking for a fight. Schofield is looking to avoid a fight. Schofield, of course, comes through country that's reasonably friendly to him. He is willing and able to buy produce from the farmers and pay them in U.S. money, which they're happy to accept. So Hood moves north. He almost traps Schofield at Spring Hill. Almost. Almost doesn't count. Counts in hand grenades and horseshoes, but it doesn't count in battles. He almost, Schofield gets ahead of him, sneaking by him basically in the middle of the night. How he didn't hear, his troops didn't hear, this entire Union Army Corps of 10,000 men trotting past him, crossing the Duck River. And this is before rubber tires. They didn't, he was never challenged. By the time Hood wakes up in the morning, Schofield is ahead of him. Schofield has started out behind him. And Schofield is between him and Nashville. Well, what is Hood going to do in a situation like that? This is the chance he's looking for. This is the battle he's looking for, the battle that will test his army's mettle, that will restore his men to fighting strength, that will destroy Schofield. Because Hood never entered a battle without the understanding that he was going to destroy the enemy army. And the fact is that with one exception, enemy army had never been destroyed before in the entire course of the Civil War. Hood's going to try to get around, he tries to get around Schofield by a flanking maneuver that would have done credit to Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was Hood's idol, but this is 1864. The Confederate Army would not move in 1864 like it did in 1862. Moreover, the Union Army would not move in 1864 like it did in 1862. In 1864, the Union Army had developed excellent cavalry and lots of it. In the United States, in Illinois, there was arranged and set up by the Army a horse farm that did nothing but breed and raise Army horses by the thousands, which the Army never ran out of horses. Confederates ran out of horses very easily and very readily. So Hood cannot get around Schofield. He cannot execute this daring flying maneuver. If Schofield had caught Hood, if Hood had caught Schofield, with Schofield's back to the river, and the river's not clear, but it's kind of along here. Schofield would have had to fight with the river to his back. He might have been defeated, but it was not the great opportunity that Hood was looking for. Hood could not have destroyed Schofield's army. A good bit of it would have gotten away to Nashville, and whatever losses Hood would have sustained were irreplaceable. They would take away from his army forever because there were no more coming. Whereas as far as the Union was concerned, there were lots of men coming. The new immigrants coming in by the hundreds of thousands, the first thing they met, the first people they met coming off the boat were Army recruiters. Many of them joined the Army right then and there, and of course became instant citizens, something you can do to this very day. So they continue north from Spring Hill toward Franklin, which is the next town on the road. Franklin's about 30 miles, maybe 20 miles south of Nashville. We're getting close. And Hood decides to give battle at Franklin. The Union forces are in front of him. Franklin is built on a river, the Harpeth River, and the river crossings are guarded by this man, General Wagner. Hood attacks Wagner first. Almost succeeds in breaking his line. Again, here's the right one. Almost. If the world could be filled with almosts, it'd be a very different place. There are the river crossings. This is the Harpeth River coming down. There are the river crossings. General Wagner is guarding these crossings here. Hood almost breaks through, but a unit led by a Colonel Updike stops them. Updike is promoted to general on the field. The only time it happened in the entire Civil War was at the Battle of Franklin. Stopped the Confederate advance. Hood then decides he's going to send the rest of his troops straight into the Union forces who are now entrenched behind fortifications, behind rocks, and he sends a direct charge of the entire Confederate army against the Union army. The result is 7,000 Confederate casualties. Most of them, well, I'm sorry, many of them prisoners, but of those casualties included 6 general officers. 5 killed outright. This one's going to get killed outright in a minute. In the course of the battle, but most importantly, this one, Cleburne, one of the best generals in the Army. He's killed in the course of the battle. He's buried in Franklin. I believe that his gravesite is still visitable at a cemetery in a church outside of Franklin. What Hood has done is to destroy his army. What's left of it trickles north around, waits for Schofield to go, because as soon as the battle's over, Schofield pulls his army out north and gets it to Nashville, where it arrives the next day. Hood following takes 1 or 2 days, and he gets up there. Well, he's there. Well, there's not a lot he can do. There's nowhere he can go. By now, Nashville is entrenched. By now, Thomas is armed to the teeth. By now, Thomas has 55,000 well-armed, well-fed men. It's December in Tennessee, and for any of you that have lived there, Tennessee is not the real South. It gets cold in the winter, and it doesn't snow as much as it rains and freezes. And that is exactly what happened. That's the state capitol. It's on a hill. This is the Cumberland River. This drawing is made from the north. The battle's going to be way down here. These are Union troops in formation, in camp, north of the river. They're going to end up going south on this bridge that they share with the railroad when the time comes. Nashville is an armed camp. Soldiers everywhere, Union soldiers everywhere, and protected against the weather. Meanwhile, Hood's men have no protection, very little food, running out of ammunition, and basically there aren't that many of them. Terribly misused by their general. And that may very well be the fact. Meanwhile, Nashville, a rail hub. If you look at this, at first it just seems like there's a little activity. But if you count, there are more than a dozen locomotives sitting here, waiting for cars, waiting for freight. A major, major rail hub, bigger than Atlanta, even today. And they're waiting because they know what is happening. Well, Thomas is ready. Thomas is prepared. He's just waiting for the right moment. But back in Virginia, Lieutenant General U.S. Grant. You can't see the third star on his shoulders, but it's right behind there. He is the commander-in-chief of all the Union armed forces, period. If he wishes, he could make all the rules. He's careful, but he doesn't like Thomas. He never liked Thomas. Thomas is too slow. Starts bombarding him. Attack now. Attack Hood while you can. He is partly the victim of very, very bad intelligence. The Union armies, since the beginning of the war, are plagued by bad intelligence. Much of it traceable to this cat. His name is Alan Pinkerton. He was to found a great deal. He was the Union's major spy master, all of that. But his work was grossly flawed. He continued Union forces with estimates of Confederate soldiers that were way over and above what they were. It was his word that stalled McClellan in 1862. When he convinced McClellan that Lee had 100,000 soldiers, Lee had less than half of that. And he's able to convince Grant. Hood has 50,000 soldiers in Nashville. Hood had less than half of that, 23,000 by his own account. Grant is a bad intelligence and jitters. The Eastern Front is stalled. Lincoln's been elected, but the casualty lists are rising, and Grant is a man of action and wants some action, and keeps sending Thomas more and more urgent telegrams. Finally orders him directly, you will attack on December 9th. December 9th, what happens? Rains the night of December 8th, December 9th, everybody wakes up to a couple of inches of ice on the entire battlefield. Well, no one can move that, but nobody understood that back in Washington, of course, so Thomas can't attack. Finally, he says he's going to move on the 12th. Same thing happens on the 12th. Grant, that's too much for Grant. Thomas had said that if Grant wishes to remove him and relieve him, he will submit, quote, without a whimper, unquote. But he's not going to attack until he's ready. Being ready means Wilson's cavalry have to be completely, totally 100%. About 90% now. That wasn't good enough for Thomas, although it would have been good enough for a lot of other highly competent generals as well. Thomas is going to wait until he has everything. Grant finally loses patience. He appoints John Logan to succeed Thomas. John Logan was one of the most successful political generals in the Civil War. Reliable, competent, would have been a great commander at Nashville, and he would have gone down in history as the victor of Nashville. But Logan is appointed and sent on a train to Nashville with orders to relieve Thomas, unless Thomas has already started his offensive. Grant, meanwhile, decides he's going to go himself as well, gets on a train at Petersburg, changing trains in Washington on December 15th, 1864, when Thomas begins his attack. The order to Logan is recalled, the order is torn up, Grant goes back to Petersburg, and they leave the fighting to George Thomas. Nashville's an armed camp on the steps of the Capitol building. Cannons. Remember, the Capitol's on a hill, so it commands all of the approaches around. If anybody even gets through the lines, even close, the cannons on the Capitol building are going to shoot them down. Well, of course, that didn't happen. Nobody ever got that far. Cumberland River, city of Nashville is on the southwest bank. The Capitol building is going to be somewhere around here. And here are the forces. They are pretty much south of the city. The Union forces here, there are a lot of them, the Confederate forces here. Hood is sort of drawn up in a line as best he could be. So Thomas starts the attack against Hood's right with a battalion of black troops. By 1864, the black soldiers, of which the Union Army would eventually have over 200,000, had proven themselves to be excellent soldiers. better, as good as anything, any other soldiers in the Army, and they were used increasingly. This group is going to start here. That's going to hold Stephen Lee, no relative to Robert, in his place, and the rest of the forces led by Wood, Schofield, and will themselves attack here. Well, all goes according to plan. The plan was worked out in considerable detail. They're pushing south, they're pushing south. Wilson is getting behind them with his cavalry. All is in order for a rout when what happens? The sun sets. December in Nashville, like December here, it gets dark early. As we all know, it starts getting dark in November. It's dark. Thomas's officers, primarily Wood, Wilson, urge a night attack. Thomas says, no, nothing doing. There's no place Hood can go. Hood's not going anywhere. So wait until the morning the next day happens. The Confederate forces, again, are pushed back. Nasty battle for this called Shies Hill. A painting made after the war. Now, if you look at enough Civil War books, and there's always a painting of some battle, after a while they all look alike. There's always raised muskets, flag of one form or another, a couple of dead men. That's it, never blood, never blown off limbs or heads or any body parts. This is kind of a generic Civil War battle painting. But at Shies Hill, the Confederates were, and from then on, the entire battle became a rout. Hood understands he must withdraw. He's got to get out of there or he's going to get trapped. So he pulls his army back, orders a retreat, and the retreat turns into a rout. And the rout turns into a pell-mell battle for survival with people running away as fast as they can. They are pursued by Wilson's cavalry. Remember, the Union cavalry is excellent by this point in time. The cavalry were also armed with new weapons, what were called repeater rifles, meaning that they could fire 7 or 8, I believe it was 7 shots without reloading. Before that, every rifle had to be reloaded before it could be shot again. And they make mincemeat out of the Confederates who flee in confusion. They take Hood with them, and they end up in Mississippi. Hood counts 12,000 men. He started with 23. Most of those 12,000 were captured. Many deserted and just kind of disappeared. They disappeared into the Tennessee landscape. The Army of Tennessee under Hood, which had been under Johnson, which had been under Bragg, never ever again took the field as a fighting force except to withdraw ultimately and surrender to Sherman. First and only time in the Civil War that happened. The Battle of Nashville was not a victory for the Union, it was destruction of an entire Confederate army. That did not happen before or subsequent. There were no major battles after Nashville. It was the most complete victory in the war. After Bull Run in 1861, the Union forces were able to reorganize in Washington. 9 months later, that army, as now recalled the Army of the Potomac, would fight the Battle of the Peninsula. Antietam, the bloodiest military day in American history. After Antietam, the defeated army, Lee's army, withdrew. September 1862, 3 months later, they were back at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg, December 1862. These are the troops advancing. These are reserves that you see here. The battle's being fought over there. And this little shack here, these are commissary wagons, by the way. Those are not Red Crosses. What's the guy in the red shirt doing? What's that? That's a leg. These are surgeons busy amputating limbs after the battle. In full view of the troops, outdoors. It's December. Why are they outdoors? Because that's where the light is. Incandescent lights had not been invented yet, and one of the major problems all surgeons had in those days was the lack of light to see what they're doing. But Fredericksburg is December 1862. April 1863, 4 months later, the Army's ready, fights another battle with Lee and Jackson at Chancellorsville. This supposedly is the last picture of Lee and Jackson together. Jackson, as we know, was killed at Chancellorsville. Whether he was a great general or not is arguable. He was killed before his time. Chancellorsville is in April 1863. 2 months later, July 1863, the Union Army fights Gettysburg, fights Lee to a draw, draws after Gettysburg. General Meade, the Union commander, is criticized roundly for not pursuing Lee. Of course, his army was physically unable to do so. But the point is that even after all these great battles, which were in one respect or another a great defeat for one army, the army withdrew, and the army successfully reorganized and, often under a new commander, came back. But there would be no more pitched battles in the Civil War. Nashville was the last. Nashville, the army that was defeated, was destroyed. There's little else for Davis to do but reappoint Joseph E. Johnson, commander of the army. At his request, Hood is removed from command, which is good because his men thoroughly disliked him, and somebody might very well have taken a pot shot at him by the spring of 1865, when it was obvious that all was lost. So Johnson, once again, is in command, but there's nothing more that Johnson can do except back up, try to get to Lee in Virginia. Sherman is pursuing him. Eventually, Sherman catches him in North Carolina. The 25th, Johnson signs the army away to Sherman. Meanwhile, into that fantasy world of which he was so good, comes up with a brilliant plan. The reason the British and the French don't recognize us is because we're a slave state. Well, that's not the reason at all. The reason they were not recognizing the Confederacy never proved that it could stand on its own and be a state. Well, now it's down to 4 states. South Carolina has been destroyed by Sherman. He's heading toward North Carolina to Johnson. So South Carolina's gone. That leaves 4 states: Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and Alabama. And that's it. That's the Confederate States of America. He sends a diplomatic mission to England and France with this proposal. If we emancipate our slaves, will you then recognize us? Well, the answer from London was no, and the answer from Paris was no. Even though Napoleon III in France is still building ships for the Confederacy, one of which, the last one, which was called the Stonewall, ended up being the nucleus of the Japanese Navy some 10 years later. But Davis has no place to go either. One of the more controversial bills that the Confederate Congress passed was to develop black soldiers, just like the Union had done, usually with freed slaves. This never came to pass. This is a imaginative drawing showing 2 black soldiers. The black forces never, although they were being organized, they never formed a unit. There were never any black men served in uniform for the Confederate States of America. The war ended before then. But Davis was willing to give up slavery in order to get diplomatic recognition. Of course, it was much too late. Lee is eventually surrounded by Grant. He has to withdraw. He has to withdraw from Richmond and flee west across the Virginia countryside. He's pursued by the Union armies, led by Sheridan. They get around him at a place called Appomattox, and he surrenders. And this is a overwrought version of what happened at surrender. Here are Southern soldiers reverently furling their battle flags. This is not a true picture. The true picture was rejoicing throughout most of the country except a few die-hard areas in the South. The Civil War was over. Lee surrenders, Grant surrenders, Johnson surrenders. April 14th, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated. Did Jefferson Davis have a role in the plot against Lincoln? There's been a lot of effort to find that out, and so far, nobody's come up with any concrete evidence. But he must have known about it. He had a news for everything. One of the great mysteries we'll never really know. But the war is over. Hood resigns from the Army, goes first into the cotton, then the insurance business, marries, will have 10 children, will die in New Orleans in the yellow fever epidemic in 1879, age 49, leaving behind 9 orphaned. His wife died a couple of days before he did, and one of his children. The Rock of Chickamauga, the Hammer of Nashville. What happened to him? He stayed in the Army. President Johnson offered him promotion to Lieutenant General, which Congress might not have approved, and command of all the U.S. armies. Johnson declined, Thomas declined, moved to California, where he died of a stroke at age 51. Irony of ironies. Hood, the most reckless, rash Confederate leader of them all, has a fort named after him in Killeen, Texas, Fort Hood. Thomas, the most successful of all the Union generals, has nothing named after him. There was no Fort Thomas, there never was, and I doubt it that there ever will be. It's too bad. This was the most successful general in the United States Army in the course of the Civil War. Never got the recognition that he truly deserved. But perhaps one could say that that is war. Thank you. Any questions? We'll take them.
English muffins named after him.
Pardon?
He had English muffins named after him.
Is named after Thomas?
Yeah, Thomas is English muffins.
Maybe a different Thomas? Don't know. Yes.
What is your opinion, the basic cause of the whole Civil War?
Slavery. Slavery. Had there not been slavery, there would not have been a civil war. All of the contentious points between the North and the South, none of them would get to the point where people were willing to fight for it, except slavery. The South fought for the freedom to keep slaves. Okay, how about that for a paradox? But without slavery, there would not have been a civil war. I believe that, although, like most of us in this room who were taught Civil War history as children, back in the days when they taught history in high school, were taught that it had nothing to do with slavery, it was states' rights. States' rights. Well, there's only one right the states wanted that they're willing to fight for, and that was the right to keep slaves, in my opinion. Yeah.
You talked about the improvement of the general, if you could.
Yeah.
What did they consider Longstreet?
One, Longstreet was tied to Lee. Longstreet was a contentious fellow. Davis didn't like Longstreet. Lee was reluctant to let Longstreet go because Lee had already lost his greatest lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson. And one of his other lieutenants, A.P. Hill, would be killed shortly before the end of the war. He didn't want to lose Longstreet, although after the war, Lee's supporters turned on Longstreet. That's because Longstreet did something really, really nasty to the South. He went into business. He earned money. That was a no-no. But there were plenty of generals other than Longstreet that Davis could have picked from. But he liked Hood for reasons that are, to me, increasingly obscure the more I learn about John Bell Hood. Yeah.
You don't think Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign gave enough evidence that he might be tough on?
If that would be, if that's usually used as the evidence that he really was a great general, and he may very well have been, but both Sherman and Grant in their memoirs, which are published and available, both said that Jackson never faced a competent Union general, i.e. he never faced Grant or Sherman. When he did face a competent Union general, that was McClellan, at Antietam, he did nothing. Jackson's corps was undistinguished at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. So it's a great question. Was he a great general? He certainly had a persona probably far greater than his actual abilities were, much like Erwin Rommel in World War II, who was considered the great Desert Fox. Was he really? He made a lot of mistakes, but we don't know. But that's one of the great arguments that Civil War buffs like to argue. Was Stonewall Jackson really a great general? Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, around the country, almost every state, I think, has a Jackson city in it, or town. Is that the Stonewall Jackson or another Jackson?
Like Andrew Jackson? Andrew Jackson, the seventh president. I don't know. I don't know. The United States Army has a post, Fort Jackson in South Carolina, which is still there. It's outside of Columbia. Was that named after Stonewall, or was that named after Andrew? I'm pretty sure it was named after Stonewall, because most of the U.S. Army forts are named after Confederate generals, not Union generals.
Tennessee is known as the volunteer state.
Yes.
Did that emanate from the Civil War or some other time?
Emanates from Davy Crockett. All volunteers, sir. Davy Crockett led his band of Tennessee volunteers to the Alamo. Now, those who don't like Texas or anything about Texas will make the sneer, and I've heard this, that, quote, if there had been a back door to the Alamo, there wouldn't be any Texas today. I don't quite believe that. But that's where the Tennessee volunteers started from. Tennessee has done its share in all the major fights that the United States has been in. Okay. Well, thank you all again. Okay, how do I shut this?